Good morning, everybody joining us in the UK. Good evening for those joining us in China or other parts of the world. My name's Hannah Bretherton, and I am the Impact and Engagement Manager at the Lao China Institute at King's College London. Thank you for joining this webinar on digital environmental activism in China. This session is part of the Lao China Institute's inaugural China Week, which is a week-long series of events and activities this year themed around climate change and the environment ahead of COP26, which begins in the UK next week. We're on day 3 of China Week, and there are lots more events ahead, so make sure to check out our website for what else we have coming up after today's session. I won't say too much more, as we have a fantastic panel chair and moderator today joining us, Dr. Champa Patel, who's the director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. And we're delighted to be running this session in partnership with Chatham House. So thank you to Champa and your team for your support. It's brilliant to be partnering on this with you. I'll now hand over to Champa, and she can introduce our brilliant speakers and the topic for today. Thank you, Champa.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you to all of us who have joined us for this really interesting and timely discussion. So as Hannah said, today we're going to be looking at digital environmental activism in China, specifically how technology and data is influencing environmental awareness across civil society, and in turn how this is then shaping environmental policy and decision-making, whether across government, NGOs or the private sector. And with us to discuss these issues, we've got a fantastic range of experts who have all been working on this issue from different angles. So we have Dr. Jin Liu, who's Associate Professor, Department of Communication, University of Copenhagen, Dr. Nian Liu, Assistant Professor, School of Culture and Communication, Capital University of Economics and Business in China, Ma Jun, who's the founding director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, Dr. Wenji Yan, Associate Professor, School of Journalism and Communication, Beijing Normal University, and Dr. Florian Schneider, who's Senior Lecturer at Leiden University. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to John Liu and Nan Liu, who will talk through some of the work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Champa, for the great introduction. So I'm going to share my screens here. So I hope that you can see my screen. Is it okay with you?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So together with Dr. Nian Liu, so we are going to talk about xenophobic nationalism in Chinese social media, discussing the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, COP26 on Weibo. So I'm going to first talk about the background of this study and our main contributions. Then Dr. Nian Liu will specify the method and finding, and I will conclude with some thoughts on the implication of this study. So the idea of this study is to explore how Chinese social media users discuss climate change and environmental issues in the case of COP26 in Glasgow. Yet you could say, to a certain degree, to our surprise, our findings illustrate some intriguing phenomena beyond the topics of climate change and environmental issues. More specifically, we have uncovered what we tentatively called a strong xenophobic nationalism on the Chinese social media, which we believe has not been recognized in previous scholarship. So why we consider the phenomenon as a nationalism? So scholarship on nationalism not only addresses xenophobia as one of the key components of nationalism, but they also argue in some occasions the nature of nationalism as xenophobic ideology. So in other words, lots of countries can be associated with patriotic attitudes, or in our case, with more malign nationalistic attitudes. So that's a negative view of nations' rivals. So in our study, xenophobic nationalism on the Chinese social media entails 3 less recognized characters. So the first thing is that it's a stand-alone hate and rejection towards foreign countries. So most study on nationalism recognize that in-war directed sentiment that had held the country together accompanies through not necessarily always comes along with an outward or directed emotions that encompass, for example, hostility towards others. But our finding shows outward directed emotions without inward directed sentiments, and of course, this absence of a clear articulation of national identity. And second thing is that most studies on nationalism, especially in the case of China, describe the nature of nationalism as a situational matter, more reactive in international affairs, unquote here. Reactive in the sense is that it is a nationalistic sentiment towards external stimulus that undermine national identity and interest. But our finding demonstrates a proactive, or you could say even assertive nationalism in this case. And third thing, we observe widespread hostilities upon select foreign countries in non-confrontational topics beyond those conflict-oriented events. So that is to say, most study on nationalism examine, you could say, a conflict-oriented event. In the case of China, for example, anti-Taiwan independence, or the Nanjing massacre and the Senkaku Diaoyudao Island event. But our case, the COP26, you could say is essentially a non-confrontational topic. Still, the topic receives aggressive reaction. So we believe that analyzing these non-confrontational cases has strategic implications for mapping out trends in public opinion towards foreign countries in China. So I will give the floor to Nian to elaborate more methods and findings.
Yeah, so we collected two sets of data in this study. The first data set is the Weibo post dataset containing the hashtag the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and it consists of 73 posts in it. And the second is the comment dataset consisting of the comments of the above Weibo posts, and it consists of nearly 6,000 comments in it. And then we conducted a semantic network analysis. First, we use Jieba, a Python program, to segment the Weibo posts and comments. And then we use WordIG to create the co-occurrence matrix, and then imported it into Gephi to visualize the semantic network and calculate the network metrics and the centrality of nodes. So next is our result. Next, please, June. Next slide, yeah. So this is the giant component. It is the largest connected subgroup in the semantic network of Weibo post dataset. So we can see the largest two clusters are the purple node group centered on Britain, and also some other words like Earth, China, protect, and some other words. And the second cluster is the green node cluster centered on climate change, and also the United Nations conference host. And the other clusters are also about the theme of the conference and the international cooperation on environmental protection. Yeah, then let's see how people respond to the themes of the two largest clusters. So this is the ego network of the word climate change in the comment dataset. There are only 11 nodes in this network, and they were divided into two clusters. One is about the climate change conference, the pink cluster, and the other is about some relevant countries like Britain, China, the green one. And next is the ego network of the word Britain in the comment dataset. There are over 300 nodes in this network. So compared with the ego network of the word climate change, this network scale was about 34 times larger. So this shows that people discussed much more about the UK than about the theme of the conference. And we colored the 5 largest clusters in this figure. The most central words for the largest cluster, the purple cluster, included Britain, country, go whoring. Go whoring means that Simon Chen, an employee of the British Consulate General in Hong Kong, was sentenced to administrative detention by the Chinese police for whoring. And also some other words like embassy in China, Wu Ruolan, she is the British ambassador to China, and shameless, and so on. So the theme of this cluster focused on some diplomatic issues between Britain and China. The central concepts in the second largest cluster, the green one, were United States police dog. This is a curse word in Chinese, and public violence, dirty cop, protest, condemn, repression. So altogether, this cluster highlighted the dissatisfaction of Chinese with relevant topics of the US, including police violent law enforcement, suppression of public protest. And the most central words in the third largest cluster, the blue one, was China, Hong Kong, hope, please, rubbish, 废青, which means the politically aggressive students without paying tax. So considering the historical background, this cluster is mainly about the Hong Kong issue that is closely related to China and Britain. And the fourth largest cluster, the yellow one, was mainly people's supportive remarks on the independence of Scotland and Northern Ireland. We can see some words like Scotland, independence, support, and Northern Ireland. And the fifth largest cluster, the orange one, was centered on the word queen, die, here, Elizabeth, whether or not, truth, haha, Hellcat. So the theme of this cluster was mainly people's doubts and ridicule about the rumor of the death of the queen. So that's our main findings.
So I'm going to conclude with 2 points here. So I think 2 specific issues we would like to highlight, so to draw your attention to our discussion on xenophobic nationalism on the Chinese social media. So the first thing, as you can see here, is like a kind of blindness. So blindness behind the root in antagonism towards other countries. So as Nian just showed, social media comments were, you could say, fundamentally off topic in this case. But that's also understandable because these topics and related sentiments exemplify the fact that relationship between China and these countries like UK and US have been frayed in this case. But blindness is also in the sense that despite that COP26 was not confrontational and the words in the original Weibo post was neither neutral or positive, the comments were full of hatred, antagonism, and xenophobia. And the second thing is that we might consider this kind of xenophobic nationalism as part of, you could say, a radical nationalism without actually love and loyalty towards the mother nation. Of course, that's a further question you could probably ask, because I think as we illustrate, only the expression of hate and rejection towards the country can be observed largely in this discussion, and extreme and irrational attitude and behavior are workshopped in this case. So that's what we would like to talk about, and we look forward to conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jun and Ian. That's absolutely fascinating to understand a little bit more about some of how public opinion or the debates that you've analyzed, the strength of feeling, it seems very much so, around issues to do with climate and the environment. Turning now to Ma Jun, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more around the work that you've been doing with IPE and the Blue Mapper app, and how you see the role of data in shaping environmental and government policy.
Thank you, Chamba, and thank you everyone for your attention. And I want to share with you some of our work, and when it comes to using environmental data to motivate change, to improve the environment. And our organization IPE was founded in 2006. At that time, China has been going through severe air, water, and soil and pollution, which exposed hundreds of millions to health hazards. We trust that issue of such a magnitude and such a complexity cannot be addressed without extensive public participation. So, and the prerequisite for that is access to information. With that in mind, we created IPE, and the first project is to develop environmental database known now as the Blue Map. Of course, in China, data can be very sensitive. The environmental data at that time could be even more sensitive. So we decided that we're going to first use the government sourced monitoring data. And but at the beginning, simply there was not that much data available. So along with NRDC, we developed the Pollution Information Transparency Index and used this to assess the performance of 120 cities for 10 years of time. And during the process, we have witnessed what can be said a historic progress made in China's environmental transparency. First year on the monitoring data, we can only compile less than 2,000 records of violations. But today that number have topped 2.1 million. And today, you know, all this data from different sources, 5,000 sources can help us to track. We're trying to track 10 million companies, and every day got more than 3 million emission data. And of course, the large volume is because China became the first in 2014 to make real-time disclosure of online monitoring data of large number of corporations. Some of the largest emitters in China are made to disclose every hour or every 2 hours. To help people access the data more easily, we developed the so-called Blue Map app and compiled all this monitoring data on the air quality, water quality, soil risk sources, and of course we put millions of emitters on the digital map. And we try to help people visualize which one is not in compliance. They will be in the color red, and so our users can not just access the data, but share that through social media, mainly on Weibo, and tagging in the official Weibo account, filing the so-called micro-reporting, and through this process motivate some of the largest coal power, iron, steel, and cement to openly address their violations. And through the process, we have witnessed also a real improvement of the air quality from 2013 after China launched the Clean Air Action Plan, and to last year, Beijing's PM 2.5 concentration dropped from nearly 90 micrograms to 38 last year. And of course, through the process, we trust that the information have helped transparency, have helped to raise public awareness, strengthen enforcement, and facilitate supervision and empower empower market-based solutions. So now China is facing this increasing more global challenges, including climate change, biodiversity, ocean. We trust that all this solutions and experience need to be tapped into. So with that, we developed the Blue Map for zero carbon, and allow people to build our users to build the all this emission data, carbon and energy data, and then based on that, co-develop the carbon peak and neutrality index on all major provinces. Use that to assess the performance of all major provinces and more than 100 cities, and to identify the the front runners and of course the laggards. And also during the process, we identified China as the factory of the world, and many of the brands who made their own carbon commitment, climate commitment, actually cannot fulfill without involving the supply chain in China. So from 2008, we've been working on this issue and with an index, and we have just launched our new annual assessment and with a ranking of all the major companies. And for the first time this year, we started assessing the performance of some of the largest state-owned enterprises and identify some of the front runners in different categories, and also the best practice like Apple, and through the gap analysis, we found that many of them, the companies don't have the basic capacity to do the accounting. So develop the digital solutions for them to do the accounting in a cost-effective way. And this solution that is now used by Dell and Foxconn to drive their supply chain to started measure, and some of them started setting their targets. And we are a member of the Green Finance Committee, and so we developed a dynamic credit rating and give color code to all these millions of companies to help the major banks like the Postal Bank of China. They started integrate our data in their banking service, and also pilot using our digital platform to drive those who borrow money to do the carbon accounting. And of course, green consumption and recycling using the digital tools as well. We're now creating this global carbon climate map just to hopefully create an accountability system of all the countries, regions, and global brands, and trying to hopefully, everyone can be motivated and empowered, and also be held accountable to all their commitments. So that's what we are doing, and this is the Blue Map app QR code, and happy to join further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjin. That's absolutely fascinating to see how you've utilized data to push for greater transparency and accountability. I'd like to turn now to Wenji Yan. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how such e-NGOs in China are working with other parts of society, such as civil society, government, and industry.
All right, thank you, Chanta. Thank you for inviting me to the China Week. Can I actually turn off my video?
Wenji, I'm not sure, there seems to be an issue with the sound. Are you close to the microphone? It's very difficult to hear you at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Can you?
That's better.
Okay, sorry. All right. So do you mind if I turn off my video talking, because I found my wireless is not quite stable when I'm showing the PPT while talking?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Actually, what Mr. Ma was just saying laid a very solid foundation to what I'm going to say, because I found our talk has very natural connection between. Actually, in my study, I used IPE as an example to study the relationship between e-NGOs and the Chinese government. But overall, e-NGOs in China nowadays have played a very active role in mobilizing public participation and assisting environmental governance. Well, traditionally, if you use the civil society theory, people tend to assume the party, the state, and the society are in a confrontational relationship. But actually, through our study, we found that's not the case. The two parties are actually in non-confrontational cooperative relationship. So I'm going to show a little bit of my research to give you some concrete examples. All right. Well, primarily we're interested in looking at how NGOs use big data platforms to mobilize the Chinese public to participate in this data activism and environmental protection. While there are numerous studies nowadays studying like the so-called environmental governance reforms in China, and scholars have used all kinds of characterizations to describe it. But the key here is really the reforms have or are aimed to create new opportunities for participation for the private citizens. Well, in our study, we just used IPE and its Blue Map APP as an example. This is a big data initiative, just as Ma Jun just explained. Well, in our study, we interviewed actually Mr. Ma, and we talked with several officers from other NGOs based in different locations in China. And we used the Blue Map APP ourselves, and we analyzed all of the micro-reporting posts on Weibo, starting from the very first day of the Weibo account being created to the end of last year. So we want to see how the public actually uses these APP to participate in this monitoring and environmental protection process. And as you can see, this is the interface of the APP, and each circle on this APP represents a enterprise. And if the circle is green, that means, okay, it's under the pollution standard, everything goes well. But if there's a polluting source, you will see the circle turns red. And using the APP, you can see all of the pollution details. And the recommended way of participation by the NGO actually is to forward and share these pollution information on people's social media accounts, such as Weibo, by adding the local environmental protection department in order to try to push the polluting enterprises to make public statements. While studying the micro-reporting, the 微举报, across almost like 7 years, we're trying to see whether there are some patterns in NGOs' mobilization of the public in this process. And we found basically, if we're right, we can divide the participation patterns into 2 stages. Roughly, it's around the year of 2017. And actually, before 2017, we found that in this stage, IPE was pretty much on the front stage because we, including Mr. Ma himself, directly participated in this Weibo micro monitoring and reporting. Well, after in recent years, the role of IPE started to retreat from the front stage to the back stage. And the main job or the function of IPE is pretty much to provide big data, the polluting data to the public, to the enterprises, and to other stakeholders. And in the early stage, we found the participants, the types of participants are more diverse, so, as you can see from this graph. And you, like, for example, the yellow part, you can see a lot of more individual participants. Well, in the later part, we noticed that the major players in this micro reporting, at least on the social media platforms, are from local NGOs, and there are quite a few major players, and they are the partner organizations of IPE. They all utilize the Blue Map data platform provided by IPE, and they do this sort of scale up reporting activities. Well, in the early stage, even though you have this high number of reporting, well, we noticed that the response rates from the local agencies, as well as the polluting enterprises were actually a little bit lower than in the later stage when these local NGOs started to really play active role in this process. Just to be to simply put, I want to just give overall characterization of some of the really I feel distinct characteristics of NGOs' role in China's environmental protection. Well, we found that from the very beginning, the so-called data-inspired public participation has seen a very inherent tension, namely, well, how to confine or limit individual participation into this framework of the local organizations' predetermined action, instead of letting them develop into these highly individualized, highly personalized expressions. Well, we found there are some mechanisms to assure this. Well, first and foremost, all of this data that people can use are actually provided by the government. They're official, so you have this sort of legitimacy of the data as well as of the participation activities. And also the appeal of this participation is not really to sanction this polluting companies, rather is to require them or to invite them to make public statements. Well, we found that similar to the data activism that has been emerging in the Western societies in recent years, data activism in China has its own inherent technical requirements for big data, for sure. While on the other hand, the emergence and development of the data activism in China requires the leadership of entrepreneurs such as Mr. Ma and other leaders of the local NGOs, as well as policy environment and a wide enough space for action with institutional approval. Well, our study finds that environmental activism supported by data technology is becoming a very important part of the overall framework of environmental governance in China. It is likely to reduce the potential for confrontations between the conventional or the assumed conflicts between state and society, while fulfilling the traditional function of environmental monitoring. Well, usually we think that institutional trust and acceptance is a prerequisite for environmental activism to occur and develop. And we believe data activism represented by the use of big data may present more new opportunities in meeting these developmental prerequisites. That's it.
Thank you, Wenji Yan. That's really interesting to hear about some of the innovations or the creative ways in which people are trying to define this space, as you note, albeit in somewhat constrained circumstances. With that, I want to turn now to Florian to talk about, a lot of our discussion is focused on mainland China, which is a particular political system. But I wondered if you could share a little bit about what's happening in Taiwan and how we might compare that with what's happening in mainland China.
Yeah, many thanks. It's a bit ironic that I'm actually focusing on Taiwan because most of my own work is very much in line with what Liu Jun has presented earlier, digital nationalism and such on the mainland. But I had the chance to do field work just before the lockdowns in Taiwan in 2019. And I was looking at how digital activism and technology more broadly and democratic politics hang together. I get a chance to say something about this on Friday as well. So today I just want to briefly give you a quick outline of how environmentalism features into these processes. And just a bit of backdrop for those of you who are not too familiar with Taiwanese politics. It's important to recall that there's these two major parties, the KMT, the Conservative Party, and the Green Party, the DPP. And it's the Green Party also because it has an environmental agenda. So there's a lot of activism that aligns itself with that particular party, which is currently also the ruling party in Taiwan. And so what I want to talk about today is actually not the progressive activism that has accompanied Green Party politics and that also shaped to a great extent the Sunflower Movement in 2014. But the counterpoint, the conservatives who have produced a backlash of various kinds of activism, some quite reactionary and often quite toxic, but some also borrowing from what the progressives have been doing in a way that challenges our understanding of the political spectrum. And specifically, I have the pro-nuclear power movement in mind in Taiwan, which is a group of private, relatively young, digitally enabled conservatives who align themselves with KMT politics when it comes to market economics and when it comes to politics more broadly, but who are, interestingly enough, quite progressive when it comes to social and cultural issues. So for instance, they also promote similar or endorse similar LGBT issues as the progressive activists. And yet when it comes to environmentalism, their solutions are market-based and based on nuclear energy and rejecting other kinds of green technologies as unfeasible or ultimately they would presume harmful in other ways to the environment. And this has led to protests and petitioning by this particular group, which has a Facebook page of 37,000 followers, posting once or twice a day, several times a day on these issues. And what I found quite interesting when I both interviewed some of these people and also looked at what they did online was how they were adjusting their strategies to the lessons of the sunflower movement. So they were taking on discursive practices that we are normally familiar with from progressive environmental and otherwise protest movements and activism. So that includes reframing the issue and focusing on democracy and participation and claiming essentially what the progressive movement during the sunflowers was claiming about the KMT, which was ruling at the time, which was that the KMT was undemocratic and intransparent in its activities. And now you have the conservatives saying exactly the same thing about the DPP, about the Green Party, and claiming that those folks are not being transparent in the way that they're setting up environmental policy, and then quoting their own activism as a form of democratic participation and a challenge to power. And what's also quite interesting is how that movement then uses nationalism. And again, there's much more to unpack than I can do here in 5 minutes, but a lot of the Green Party base, especially in the deep south and the deep green south of Taiwan, is quite nationalist. It's Taiwanese nationalists rather than Chinese nationalists, but it's still very nationalist and often quite xenophobic when it comes to mainland China. And so the conservatives who are more aligned with a pro-China activity, with more pro-China activities, are using that nationalism in order to say, you know, if you want to be anti-Chinese, why are you not supporting energy autarky, which would be more easily achievable with nuclear energy? So they're kind of occupying the nationalist arguments about Taiwan and trying to co-opt some of the arguments on the green side. And similarly, also co-opting the idea that the debate is shaped by misinformation and by disinformation campaigns, and giving their own activism a sense of sort of scientific, rationalist reasoning. And in fact, the Facebook group is called Nuclear Mythbusters. So they're setting themselves up as if their particular position was the scientific, quote unquote, truth, which is in itself also quite interesting. So I just want to wrap up these observations with some lessons that we might want to draw from this. The first is that it is indeed quite difficult to compare the Chinese and the mainland Chinese and the Taiwanese situation. On Taiwan, you have much more confrontational streams of activism, but there are also collaborations, particularly when it comes to these large parties. And we might want to, as a lesson for European or American or UK politics, rethink the political spectrum and ask ourselves whether it makes sense to talk about these things in terms of left and right, and what role power plays to these activists from these different streams of ideological positioning as they potentially colonize and co-opt various kinds of counter agendas, for example, the progressive agenda in the service of a more conservative set of politics. So that is my contribution today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. I think really interesting to hear the contrast in terms of, you know, how different political systems can create different spaces for different types of activism. I have a question for the panel, and to our audience, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and share your thoughts with us, which I will then ask our experts who are with us today. I wanted to ask you, because we focused a lot on the different types of spaces that are being created, the different types of activism, what people are doing in order to push for greater accountability or transparency. But how much influence does this actually have on decision-making within the government? How responsive are they to this? How sensitive are they to the criticism? So it'd be interesting if you could draw out, all of you, a little bit more, how much you think it actually does have an influence on decision making, or is it, you know, a lever that the government can draw on for changes that they were going to make anyway? Florian, maybe if we start with you and we can go in reverse.
Yeah, sure. This is there's two parts, two answers to this. So the first is that in Taiwan, pretty much all the actors involved, whether it's civil society actors or political actors like the parties, have as their baseline that Taiwanese democracy and the procedures of democratic politics matter, that this is absolutely essential to have a functioning, transparent government in order to provide a counterpoint to what happens in mainland China. And so pretty much everyone is towing that line, regardless of whether they agree with each other on the details or not. And in that sense, activism tends to have quite an impact because the political actors are in a rhetorical bind to say, well, we're going to have to live by the principles that we keep announcing and pronouncing. At the same time, you often hear from the critics, this was the case in the Sunflower Movement, and now by the conservative critics, that the government is actually only paying lip service to these ideas of democratic politics and is often undermining them when it doesn't suit its agenda. So an example that has little to do with environmentalism, but that the environmentalists often raise was the LGBT activism in the wake of Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP's win in 2016. So in 2018, there was a referendum on LGBT rights, and it looked like the DPP was going to sweep through that issue easily because of the young people who supported it and how visible it was on social media. And it turns out that there were plenty of conservatives also on the Green side who are extremely anti-LGBT. And so the DPP lost the referendum and then pushed through its agenda anyways, which, as progressive would say, you know, thank goodness. But from the conservative perspective is a sign that the DPP is actually not following through with its own procedures that it had announced earlier. So there is a little bit of a tension there in Taiwan.
Thank you. Junliu, if we turn to you.
Yes, thanks. I think in our case, I would say that even though I think the original idea is to see how people engage into the conversation about climate change and environmental issues, but I think what we observe, this emergence of a xenophobic discourse, shows that it's fundamentally, you could say, different from traditional elements of Chinese cyber nationalism, because as we illustrate, I think it's less about, you could say, historical memories of pride and humiliation in Chinese history. Rather, it represents a very aggressive way of engaging into the debate, you could say, in a broader sense, the debate on political norms and values of the present, how the global order could be a kind of reimagined in this case, how international relationship could be kind of reconstructed in this sense. So I think that if we look at the public sentiment in this case, will share some new light for us to understand, you could say, the relationship between China and what we generally call the West, and also especially how Chinese people perceive the Western world in this case.
Thank you. Nian Lu, if we turn to you.
I think Jun already concluded our ideas and thoughts in our paper. So I agree with him.
Marjun, if you wanted to come in on, I mean, a lot of your work has been trying to influence this decision making, right? So in what way do you see that the government or the authorities are responsive to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I would say that I really appreciate Professor Yan, and I have to say, although it's a case study based on our Blue Map app, it's the first time for me to in person heard her talking about this. So it's very interesting. I really appreciate it. And I think in more recent years, I think the social media have played some vital role, and Blue Map is just a part of that, a small part of that, and we try to facilitate broader, more extensive public participation, and only that we trust can really help reshape the government policy, and it works. The classic case is how the public participation in China help reshape the government policy on air quality monitoring and disclosure. Prior to 2013, now China did not conduct monitoring on PM 2.5 and ozone. We as an NGO have done our air quality transparency research along with Renmin University and come up with an air quality transparency index in the end of 2010. But it was the people, millions upon millions of netizens made their voice heard over social media, demanding for the truth, demanding for the data on air quality. Of course, during the long stretch of smoggy days in 2011, not just hit Beijing, but the whole big region in China. So the government lent an ear to that voice, and toward the end of that year, 2011, the central government made a decision. From 2013, China gonna monitor and disclose PM 2.5. Of course, it's not enough just to know which day to put on face mask or lock their children indoor. So along with 25 other NGOs, we launched the Total Transparency Initiative and calling for the disclosure, real-time disclosure of online monitoring data. And to our surprise, the ministry came up with a bylaw several months later and make that happen from 2014. That initiate the Blue Map app because it's online, it's real time every hour with all this disclosure, making China the first country in the world to make that disclosure. And I also mentioned about our pollution information transparency index. And through that process, we have seen a vast expansion of environmental transparency. Of course, also the change of legislation. NGOs like us got involved in the legislative process. It's kind of 4 or 5 years of back and forth discussion on the amendment of Chinese environmental basic law. And eventually, this law in 2015 created the first ever chapter, Chapter 5, titled Transparency and Public Participation. This is the first ever legislation in China which got this special section. And of course, on the quality, environmental quality side, from air to water to carbon to biodiversity to soil, we continue to work with other NGOs like Alashan SEE Foundation and Friends of Nature, our partners, work together to go through the Lianghui, the Congress meeting, to send motions and require for its disclosure. And today, more than 20,000 monitoring stations on rivers and lakes and the coastal seas got disclosed and put on our app. Of course, we have failures. The failure soil pollution situation has yet to be fully disclosed. Much of that has not been disclosed, and despite many years of attempt, of advocating for this, and more recently, until very, very recently, we started seeing some disclosure on the soil pollution side. Happy to see that. On the climate carbon side, we also failed for quite a few years. And
I guess there's still work to be done, right? I mean, if we can turn now to Wenji and to hear your thoughts on this question, to what degree do you think this digital activism is influencing decision-making within the Chinese government?
Sure. While the other speakers were talking, I was just trying to sort out my thoughts. And I think there are at least several aspects that make these, especially this new form of database environmental activism more influential than the traditional ones, I think. Well, first of all, you can tell like the Chinese government right now is initiating this sort of institutional construction, right, under the name of governance reform. There is this oral reform, and also in this environmental area, there are all kinds of different kinds of laws, regulations coming up. And just in this latest one that was passed last year, the very specific guidelines that specify the responsibilities of local governments at different levels and corporate entities for environmental protection. And also they encourage the public participation. So definitely on one hand, from this at this institutional level, you see this greater space for the participation of ENGOs. And I remember when I was talking to Mr. Ma and other officers of ENGOs, and they gave me a lot of examples of how they're sort of this collaboration with the local governments and sort of pressure the governments to take actions. And from their experience, and at least I feel that the governments become more conscious than before. They notice that the problems, the pollution problems, cannot be really battled by themselves alone. They have to bring in these social forces, including ENGOs and the public. So this is on this institutional level. And also along with that, the second part is you see this internal evaluation system. That is, if the local governments, you don't do anything to sort of fight the local pollution, that will be part of your the evaluation items within the system from the upper level of the government. So that means there will be really concrete consequences for the local officers if they don't do anything to this on this. Well, but with all of this, I want to emphasize one last thing based on our observation in our study. Surely you can't really give a sweeping conclusion or characterization for China across all of the different areas, because this is just so large a country. And from our observation, there is this between area or between provinces differences in the responsiveness in terms of how responsible the local governments are. And what we found is provinces like Shandong province, Jiangsu province, Zhejiang province, all of which are actually clustered around this eastern coast area of this country. For these local governments, they are really responsive. They have greater presence on the social media platforms, and also they take better utilization of this sort of reporting system through social platform or through other like hotlines or other online venues, regardless. But these provinces, they do respond to these public and ENGOs appeals very effectively, while compared to them, some inner provinces performs rather less well. That's what we observe, at least based on our empirical data.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point there, that this is a large, complex country, and it is going to vary province by province. So I think that's really interesting to point out just the variation in terms of how different provincial level authorities might be responsive to this activism or not. We're coming up to the end of our time, so I want to very quickly do a quick go round and ask you all just one way in which you think what's a likely future trend we're going to see, because this is an area that's only set to increase. We're going to see more and more increased digital activism. We're going to see different types of digital activism. So I wondered if you could share what you think might be a likely future trend or a key issue or sensitivity that's going to, be a source of tension in the future. But when we look at digital environmental activism, how do you see this evolving as we move forward? So why don't we start with June? And this could be in terms of the debates that are happening online. What do you think will be the one thing that we may see a future potential trend?
Thanks, Champa, for this time to ask a very reflective question. So I think after our study on this xenophobic nationalism, we actually try to make a connection to some of the discussion on, you could say, political contentions within the Chinese mainland towards either the local or the central government, in which they describe one of the key characteristics is about the anger venting. So it's called anger venting kind of social incident. So because they reflect, you could say, a generalized anger or sentiment that has been built up over time, and that has been released when an incident, sometimes you could say a relatively minor one, occur. So what we observe is quite similar in this case, even though I think the COP26 is basically has nothing to do with a kind of nationalism or nationalistic sentiment in this case. So what we observe is within a very short period of time, large number of people, most of whom actually you could say a large number of comments, most of which has no relation or less relation to the topic, actually mobilize, accumulate quickly, and engage into the discussion with sometimes you could say extremely assertive comments. So I think this kind of anger venting, online behavior, public sentiments will be one of the issues that we will need to pay attention to, because I think you could probably say this xenophobic sentiment is very dangerous in an increasingly globalized world in this case.
Yeah, thank you. Nian, what would you say is a potential future thing to look out for?
Yeah, and actually, I have a question that we are thinking about. Is what is the difference between the nationalism and as Jun just said, the just anger venting event. So I was wondering that if we could call it a nationalism because it's just a xenophobic event. So we will work on that. We'll work on that. Yeah. So that's my thought here.
Thank you. Marjun, how do you think the future of digital environmental activism is likely to evolve in China? Is there any particular one thing that we should be looking for, or do you foresee a particular area where there might be tension?
Yeah, I very much appreciate what all the scholars are their research, and I think this is a global challenge. With all this information, sometimes an ocean of information, and probably what can we trust? And people got quite cynical. Not just in China, the netizens, sometimes can voice, can get quite polarized, and it's not helpful to the whole society. So I just hope that on the environment side, it's happened to be a social field that we can do more work based on science, based on data. And I do hope that all these new IT technologies, while it's creating all these troubles, if we can tap into them, the big data, the cloud computing, and AI technology, Internet of Things, 5G, all this blockchain can really help us to connect the missing dots in this globalized manufacturing, sourcing, and investment and consumption. I think only this provide an opportunity for us to green the whole process to make it really low carbon. I think let's seize this opportunity, because this is the only, one of the very few areas that we have social consensus built. The reason that we can continue to enjoy so much space in China is because on this single issue, there's so much social consensus. And I think globally, with the current geopolitical tension going on, only on the climate, on the biodiversity, ocean issue, we have so much consensus. So let's seize this opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant rallying cry, because it's how do you capitalize on these opportunities, but also minimize the risk of any unintended harm, right? Wenjian, over to you.
Sure. Actually, I can agree with Mr. Ma more, because I think this is the environmental issue is one of the areas in this country where you see this wider consensus. like from different forces, including the government, the public, and the policy entrepreneurs and ENGOs, so on and so forth. So there's definitely an opportunity for data activism to play a bigger role. Well, and I think once once technology starts, it has its own momentum, right? It's hard really to stop it right away. But I want to say I'm sort of qualified optimistic or conservative optimistic, because I think the extent to which we can be optimistic it's really depending on some contextual issues, because technology cannot solve everything. It's utilized by people, and I think in China it's really important to have this institutional approval and acceptance from the system. I don't know, like I don't know how much we can predict on that part, but I feel for now, a really important thing that we can do is to really increase the scale of data activism. Because right now, I don't know whether it's because we just focus our study on IPE as the case and several other local ENGOs, but according to our observation, similar kinds of organizations are really limited in terms of the scale, in terms of the volumes. And of course, I don't know if it's, I think it's a good thing for even IPE when you have more competitors, right? Once you have this force, the social force, the data force scale up in the society, and I believe there will be more thing that people can do in the future.
Thank you. And over to Florian now. And I'm going to try and incorporate a question that's come into your final thoughts. But how, in terms of how things move forward, how might these ENGOs actually drive digital activism in China or Taiwan? What is it? What might that look like moving forward?
You're putting me on the spot on the ENGOs. I can't really comment on that. That'll be a question, I think, for the other colleagues. But yeah. I can say that I do agree with what the other colleagues have now said. Marjin pointed out transnational dynamics. Now that's a big potential for change. I agree. But I also see a couple of potential risks. One is the kind of polarization that we've now also seen in the other research, and that we see in pretty much everywhere, right? So in Taiwan and China. So the emotional charge polarization of these issues is a serious problem. And I think that also means that the digital potential or the potential to use digital technologies for change is limited to the extent that it relies on good design. So something like Facebook or Twitter is poorly designed and is a very bad option for creating a context for discussion, as is Weibo for that matter, or WeChat. These are not the right forums to create discussion. So I think we're going to see more activism that focuses on commerce, on trying to leverage the power of consumerism in order to change how stakeholders behave, particularly with reference to corporate social responsibility or enterprise social responsibility. We just published a report at the Leiden Asia Center about this yesterday, actually, on corporate social responsibility of Chinese actors in Congo. But having said that, I'm not entirely convinced that that avenue of pressure is sufficient to make real changes, because it still relies on the neoliberal capitalist context. And unless that gets undermined and changed, I'm not entirely convinced that we have the tools to really change environmental politics around the world. Slightly more pessimistic note.
No, but I think it's important. We've got conservative optimism, cautious pessimism, maybe optimism. But certainly what it shows is that this is a vibrant space. It's still evolving, it's changing. It seems that there will be scope for more of this moving forward, whatever that might look like, dependent on the technologies that are out there. So all that's left for me to say really is thank you to our speakers for sort of shining a light on an aspect of Chinese society and culture that we don't often get to hear about. So thank you for that. And thank you to our audience who joined to hear our experts today. As Hannah said earlier, this is part of China Week. There will be further sessions coming up, but I'm sure this is a topic we will return to beyond COP. So look forward to continuing the discussion with you all. Thank you.